Hello everybody, I'm Agent 007. Today I'll be showing you how to change out the rotors, brake pads, as well as the bearings on a 1997 Dodge Ram 1500 with independent front suspension. First we'll need to block off the tires. Next we can jack up the vehicle. Before we jack up the vehicle completely, what you're going to want to do is break these lugs free. Not completely, but just enough so that whenever it's fully jacked up, you'll be able to get the nuts off. Then you're going to want to put some jack stands underneath. Now the tire can come off. Next we'll be taking off this caliper, which these bolts back here, there's two bolts, one here and one down here. And they will be taking a 3/8 inch Allen key. Okay, now that those bolts are out of the way, we can remove this caliper. Okay, we now have the caliper free, but what you want to do first before you take it all the way off is get a bungee cord or some kind of string and tie it up to somewhere like up here, and then tie it to the caliper so that it's not hanging by this hose. Now that the caliper is secure, we can now take off this grease cap to take off the rotor. Underneath this glob of grease is a cotter pin, so you want to take that out first before you get to the nut. Okay, now that the cotter pin's out, we'll now take off this nut retainer. Now we'll be taking off this nut that holds the rotor on with an 11 or a 1 1/16 inch socket. You probably won't even have to have a huge breaker bar like this to take off the nut, because these are usually supposed to be hand tightened anyway. Okay, we now have the nut out, and there's also a little washer behind that, and also the front bearing. You can tell that the rotor is starting to slip because this right here is your bearing. Now we'll take off the rotor. Now that we have the rotor off, this right here is your seal, and this in here is your rear bearing. And if you decide you want to keep your old bearings, that's fine. I mean, I'm planning on using new bearings. If you don't use new bearings, it's not going to hurt my feelings. But what you want to do is re-grease these old ones. But if you get new ones, be sure to grease those up. Basically what you do is just put some grease in the palm of your hand, and with your other hand you'll take the bearing, and on its side, just pretend like that's my palm, you'll put the edge on your palm, and so that'll make the grease come up through there. But if you're using your old bearings, you want to make sure to get all the old grease out. Now we will clean off the spindle with an old rag. You can also use some brake cleaner if you want. What we want to do before we put in the new bearings and the new rotor, we want to spray down the rotor with some sort of brake cleaner to get all this oil and stuff off. And the other side. Okay, before we put the greased up bearings inside the rotor, what we need to do is make sure that the spindle is nice and greased up, as well as the inside of the rotor. You don't have to worry about the other side right now, just grease up this side, and watch out for getting grease on this part of the rotor, because that's where your brakes are going to be. So now we'll slip our rear bearing in, see, like this. Oh, and these rotors already came with a track, so I didn't even have to worry about putting one of the tracks in. Next, we'll put our seal on top of that, just like so. And you'll probably have to knock it in with a hammer, just very lightly though, don't hit it too hard. Okay, now we'll put our rotor and rear bearing on the spindle. Now we have the rotor and rear bearing on. So what we want to do now is just grease up the inside track quite a bit. Make sure there's plenty of grease, and put in the front bearing. Okay, so the front bearing is in, as well as the washer, and now I'm going to put this nut on. Now that we have the nut on, we want to take our 1 1/16 inch socket and tighten down this nut to 30 to 40 foot-pounds. Then we'll back it off from that and then just tighten it with our hands. Tightening it to 30 to 40 foot-pounds is just setting the bearings, and you don't want to keep it that tight. You want to back it off and just tighten it back, hand tight. Now we'll put on the nut retainer, as well as put in a cotter pin. We now have everything on: the rotor, the bearings, the washer that's holding on the bearing, the front bearing, and the nut retainer, and also the cotter pin, as well as the grease cap. So now all we need to do is just kind of hit this with a hammer a few times, make sure it's on good. Clean up the rotor a little bit, make sure it's not greasy so it doesn't get on the brake pads, and we're done with the rotor. Now we're going to take out the brake pads out of the caliper. So now we'll just pull this pad out, as well as this one. And you can also spray some brake cleaner if you want to around this caliper. But next, now we're going to knock these little pins out so that we can put in some new ones. Okay, now the pins are out. Now I went ahead and bought some little O-rings for the caliper here, and they're where the pins slide in and out. And see, there's also a little rubber thing here on this side. They're pretty easy to take off. Over here though, it's a little bit harder to take off. Just take a pair of pliers, anything will work, a screwdriver or whatever you can think of, and just kind of get behind here. You may want to use a little brake fluid to try to loosen things up a little bit. And after some mental and physical persuasion, it comes right up. I also want to mention that there are some gaskets that are inside here, 2 gaskets, besides the outer ones that you probably want to replace. I'm going to. They'll help your pins that go inside slide in and out easier. And now we're done with the gaskets. Now we're going to put the pins into the slots. So here are the pins installed. I just wanted to point out, it's very important to replace these pins. I mean, you don't have to, but I decided to go and replace mine, and I'm glad I did, because looking at these pins, they can slide easily in and out. But one like this was my old one, it can't even push back in. That's how rough it was and how old it was getting. As well as this one. This one wouldn't even come out. And if that didn't convince you, if you look at this brake pad, it wears so unevenly. See, this is down to the very bare metal. See, this had a little bit left. That was from the pins getting stuck and not being able to move the caliper freely. Now we're going to use this C-clamp to push in this piston so that we can put in the brake pads. But first you want to make sure to take off this cap on the brakes. Whoops. That's great. Well, to let the system breathe, and so now it can breathe. Just leave it slightly open like that. Now we'll compress the piston. Okay, now that the piston is compressed, we can now put in the brake pads. Be sure whenever you're about to put the brake pads in, and or if you have gloves on, be sure that they're not oily or anything, because if you get the brake pads oily, that won't be good, and you'll be finding yourself replacing some parts pretty soon. One thing you do want to do is add some brake lubricant in the moving parts, such as this, like around the back. Of course, not on the actual pad itself, on the front part, but be sure to get the sides and the back and Also on the other pad as well. Get these clips in back of the pad to minimize squeal. Okay, so now that they're greased up, we'll go ahead and install them into the caliper. Okay, there's the first pad in. Now we'll move on to the second pad. Now that both brake pads are installed, we'll install the caliper on the rotor. Okay, now we have the caliper on. And before you put the caliper on, be sure to pull these bolts out a little bit or you'll never get the caliper on. So now we'll finish installing the caliper by tightening up these bolts. Be sure whenever you're finishing up to tighten these bolts pretty tight, because of course you don't want your brake caliper coming off. And if you want to, you can use some thread locker to make sure that these bolts stay in place. Be sure that you put your cap back on your brake reservoir whenever you get done with the caliper, because you don't want moisture and everything in here. Whoops. Okay, so we have our bearings in, we have our new rotor on, we have our new brake pads, and we have everything lubed up really nice. Just be sure to double check your work, make sure that nothing's missing, no cotter pins are missing, make sure you greased up everything that needed to be greased, and if you're sure that you have everything done right, then I guess we can put the tire back on now. Alright, so the tire's all down and we're all done.